Yeah, so I thought I'd talk today about a show that I wouldn't normally talk about because it's not written in the way most narrative stuff is, and that's because it's not narrative. It's a game show. Big Brother. It has sort of a very strange reputation because there's a million versions of it, and the American version I don't necessarily think is the best version, but it's America doesn't really have panel shows the way I've been watching a lot of British panel shows lately. Taskmaster, Would I Lie to You, 8 out of 10 Castles Countdown. So it's basically the premise of those are all very similar, where you get comedians and or famous people to play a game for like an hour. Interesting, interesting idea. The American versions, I don't know. There's like American game shows. There's 20 new high concept like giant audience game shows every year, but these whole like spending time with specific actors and comedians over a long period of time, something like Taskmaster, isn't really a thing in the US, although there was an American Taskmaster that failed miserably. I think Reggie Watts was the host. But Big Brother does something interesting, and that's like on the face of it, it's just like a reality show the way the early 2000s era reality shows are, where you pick a bunch of sort of wannabe famous people, and you just put them in a house and you make them do frivolous competitions to eliminate each other until there's just one. Yeah, that's not. I mean, it's not a fresh idea, but I think what Big Brother does so well is the first couple episodes are super cringy because they do these like talking heads, and they do these sort of like who they are in real life sort of videos trying to explain who they are, and they way oversimplify stuff. If you're a nurse, everything that you're going to talk about, especially for the first few weeks, is going to be nurse puns and ideas about working in the medical field. If you're a pilot, same thing. It's only going to be talking about aviation and airplanes and the flying puns, and that's kind of all they do. But then something happens a couple weeks into the show that gets a lot less cringy, which is, or I guess not. That's not true. It's still very cringy because these people are cast specifically for their obnoxious personalities and the fact that they want to become famous. But they it's a different kind of cringe because the leaning heavily into whatever their stereotype is sort of fades away and is only really relegated to the diary room when they do talking heads. And the rest of the time, they're just being themselves. And you find out they're a lot more complex of human beings than the show would have initially indicated they are, which is really interesting because you find most of these people have a pretty similar sort of character profile. They're very shallow. They're very one dimensional thinking, but they're still complicated human beings, and they're dealing with complicated human being stuff, which I think is what's so interesting is that Big Brother somehow, just by the fact that these people are stuck in a house over a period of time, the sort of like the whatever, the veil, the cone of silence, whatever restrictions they had in sort of hiding their true personality sort of goes away because it's fatigue and it's just a period of time. I think of it sort of the same reason. It's like the honeymoon phase of Big Brother is all the if you're a cowboy, it's going to be all cowboy stuff. You're going to be wearing hats and there's going to be sound effects, but eventually you realize that this person is not a cowboy. They're also they're interested in trains, or they have a really close relationship with their mother, like really specific things that define them almost more than what Big Brother has chosen for them to be. It's interesting. And so it's, the way you do it in narrative is you make these characters complicated and have, conflicting inner lives and all these kind of things. But the reality is Big Brother sort of backed into it just based on the fact that these people are stuck with each other. And at some point you run out of interesting things to say. You can only tell the new group of friends that story so many times before everybody goes, yeah, we've heard that. And you go, okay, well, you're right. I've been leaning on that story too much. Maybe I should actually talk about the time that this happened to me and I have mixed feelings about it, like really complicated stuff. That's not to say Big Brother doesn't go to the well of, I have a family member who's suffered or a family member who's died, and that's an important motivating factor for what I'm doing. They still go on to that, but it's as much a part of the show as the other stuff, where you realize that this pageant queen really does have mixed feelings about working in pageants her whole life, and maybe it's time to actually pursue something other than just, attention, or you're a farmer. Again, I keep going back to farmers because they seem lately to really want to pull out like people out of the Midwest, out of obscurity. I think in order to expand their, I don't know, it's either way, but you find out they're a farmer, but really they have ambition to be a singer. Like something so interesting about Big Brother is these people come into the house expecting one thing, and then they leave the house expecting something else. And part of that is the friendships, because again, when you're just stuck in stressful situations with people, you either become friends or enemies. It's sort of just how things work. But it's also, people get a little bit of time to think about who they are and think about what they want to do, which I think is very, very useful, because you don't usually in regular life, unless you actively do that, have an opportunity to do that. For me, it was therapy. So it's just this weird thing where, it's very counterintuitive to me, because everything on the face of Big Brother, I find yucky, I find fake, I find artificial. But once you get past a couple weeks of the show and people actually start behaving in their sort of regular state of how they live their lives, to a point, they're still locked in a house with a bunch of strangers, but you once the artifice goes away, you realize these people are actually complex, feeling, thinking human beings that have wants and needs and minutia that you wouldn't on the face of a flashy, bright show where the lights are always on, where everybody's mic'd up, you don't expect. So that's why I watch it. I'm fascinated with Big Brother. I can't stand the first couple episodes because, again, this sort of like establishing characters thing is just. I mean, you need to be able to separate characters out because there's so many characters at the beginning. Honestly, I would rather just them each wear a different color for a week so I could just associate a color with them. But that's sort of just how my brain works. But it's so weird. And then by the end of it, once competition heats up and it gets down to like the final 4 or 5 people, it's all anything goes. But sort of that period in the middle, I find it really satisfying because you get a pretty good and you get a pretty specific understanding of who these characters are. And I think that's what attracts me to these characters and I'm calling them characters because, again, they're in extraneous situations that they wouldn't normally be in. So some of it's a little more and less, but you find a connection to these characters, which I think is what's so good. Survivor does this too, and I think that's why a reason why Survivor has succeeded so long is, again, when you have nothing to do and you run out of things to talk about, like who are you and what are you about, I think is really interesting, and I think it really does a good job, in human connection. That's what I had. Basically, what happened today was I stayed up all night watching a movie that I decided not to review because negative reviews means negative people attacking you in the comments, and I just didn't feel like that today. So I thought I'd talk about something I wouldn't normally talk about, which is I like Big Brother. I like Big Brother for what it is. I have really mixed feelings about who they cast and how they cast people in Big Brother, because I feel like it's a missed opportunity for them to cast more interesting people, but I understand why they do, because you need big personalities in a building like that. Otherwise, the show doesn't work. But, I keep coming back to it. It's one of those things. It's kind of like how all these, The Bachelorette and The Bachelor, they do that, but I'm not even sure that's as real as something like Big Brother, because at the end of the day, The Bachelor, you could carry the lie all the way through as a contestant on The Bachelor, whereas Big Brother, it's kind of hard because at some point you run out of everything, patience, things to say, the giving a crap part of your brain turns off at some point, and so all right, that's what I got.